Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about the end of the Civil War and some of the consequences of the war as well. So we are going to start off today in early 1865. So at this point, Lincoln has taken his second oath of office. He's given his second inaugural address, talking about how he wants to reconcile all the issues of the Civil War and kind of heal the country and move past it. And that's largely because it's looking like the war is going to end pretty soon. The Union knows it, the Confederacy knows it, and on April 2nd, 1865, Jefferson Davis leaves Richmond. He sets the whole thing on fire because he knows that it's going to be taken by Grant and Sherman's troops. One of the reasons why he probably set Richmond on fire or he destroyed it is because he didn't want there to be any documents or any evidence that could maybe be used against him in a trial if he were to be put on trial after the Civil War. But basically, it's also like the mentality like, I can't have it, no one can. But this is definitely signaling the capture of Richmond, which is the last step of the Anaconda Plan, definitely signaling that the war is over. And so, to officially end the war, one side has to surrender to the other, and a treaty is agreed to, or documents are signed. And so, this happens on April 9th, 1865. Grant and Lee. Grant is the Union general. Lee is the Confederate general. They meet in Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse and they sign surrender documents where really Grant is very lenient to Lee and the Confederate troops. And that's because Lincoln told him to be lenient. Lincoln said, listen, I'm trying to heal this country as soon as possible. Don't punish those Confederate troops. Let them keep their weapons. Let them keep their horses, give them food, and let them go home. We're not arresting anyone today. We really just, we're happy this war is over and we want to try to heal these wounds as soon as possible. So this signals the official end of the Civil War, where you have Lee surrendering to Grant. So this is April 9th. All right, fast forward another week now. The war's been over for about a week and Lincoln gets assassinated. So actually on April 14th is when Lincoln gets shot, but he dies on April 15th. He hangs on for a few hours throughout the night. But basically what happens is Lincoln and his wife are at a play in Washington, D.C. at Ford's Theater, and Lincoln is shot in the head by an actor, actually, but a Confederate sympathizer, which means like a person who agrees with the South. He's shot by John Wilkes Booth. And again, because Bill Booth was an actor, it wasn't weird to see him in the theater, and he was able to get past some of the security outside Lincoln's balcony door and shot Lincoln, where Lincoln died the next day. Now, Booth escaped. He jumped down off the balcony onto the stage where he twisted his ankle or maybe broke his ankle, but he kind of hobbled off the stage. And then he went on the run for about 2 weeks. So he leaves Ford's Theater, he heads down through Maryland, down into Virginia, where eventually he is kind of cornered by troops in a farm. And the troops set the farm on fire, basically trying to smoke him out. And he ends up shooting some guns out of the barn. The troops shoot back, and he ends up being killed that way. So he never faces any kind of trial for the assassination of Lincoln because he was killed. There were some people, though, that helped him plan this assassination. Actually, Lincoln's assassination was part of a much larger plan to kill Lincoln, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, and his Secretary of State, William Seward. But really, the only successful part of the plan was Lincoln's assassination. But the other guys who helped Booth plan the assassination were put on trial and they were executed. But anyway, so Lincoln is now dead. So this isn't the first time that the vice president has to take over for the president in terms of a death in office, but this is the first assassination in office where the president is killed. So the nation is still trying to, heal from the Civil War, and then the president gets killed. And the guy who's kind of left with the mess is President Johnson. And we will be talking about him later on in the next few objectives because it is a mess with President Johnson. So let's spend the rest of the notes today looking at some of the consequences of the war. So we're going to break these up into political, social, and economic. Remember, political aspects just really mean like things that have to do with the government or laws or things like that. Economic aspects are things that have to do with money. And then social aspects are things that have to do with how people relate to each other and like society and culture and that kind of thing. So we'll start with political. A big thing here is that the Civil War sets a precedent for increased federal power. No state has tried to seriously secede from the country since the Civil War. Because the Confederacy did not succeed in becoming its own nation, the federal government won, right? The Union, the United States, they won. And so the federal government uses this opportunity to assert or gain more power over the states. This is also the first time where there were laws passed to require conscription, which is the draft. The draft is used again in World War I and World War II, in the Korean War, in the Vietnam War. It hasn't been used recently, though. We seem to have a big enough volunteer base for the military, as well as the type of weapons that we have and the type of fighting that's done today. Just really doesn't require like a huge, manpower, behind the army. However, men, when they turn 18, are required to basically fill out documents that would go into a draft if we were to have one. Lincoln used his power as president during the Civil War to expand the executive branch or to expand executive power, even sometimes not listening to the Supreme Court when they said that he was not allowed to suspend habeas corpus, but he did it anyway. But in Lincoln's mind, he was doing everything he had to do to keep the country together. That would have been his excuse for using his presidential power. And then lastly is one of these questions that we need to face now that we are ending the war and trying to move on past it, is what to do with those rebel states, what to do with the Confederate leaders. Should they be put on trial? Should they be executed? Should the states be punished harshly, or should they be like welcomed back into the country? All of those things are going to be political questions for after the war. Another big question after the war was, what to do about enslaved people. The war was largely, thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, framed as a way to end slavery. And so we actually see that slavery is ended and the rights of Black Americans are addressed in the years following the Civil War. There are several amendments that are passed in this time period coming up called Reconstruction that basically give and protect rights to freed people living around the country. Now, even though these things are on paper, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, by no means does that mean that there's like no racial issues in the United States. These amendments on paper are not going to be followed through in the South, especially the 15th Amendment with voting. So let's go through these real quick. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gave all people equal protection under the law, and it provided citizenship for people born in the United States. So this made all former slaves citizens because they were born in the US. And then lastly, the 15th Amendment granted suffrage or voting rights to male citizens regardless of race. But again, we're going to see in the next few objectives how Southern states try to get around these amendments to basically keep Black people in bondage. A good way to remember these three amendments is free citizens vote. So the 13th Amendment goes with free, 14th Amendment goes with citizens, and then 15th Amendment goes with vote. That's just an easy little memory tool that I use. Okay, next we have the economic consequences. War is super expensive, even if you win, probably especially if you win. Here we can see that the Union spent more money than the Confederacy, but they had more money than the Confederacy. They also make some of that money back because of the factory production. But the Union also gained money because they used income tax for the first time during this war to raise money. The South, though, is going to struggle economically. Their agricultural base is largely affected because the land is destroyed, as well as they don't have slavery anymore. So their labor force has been disrupted. And all of their infrastructure, their railroads, their telegraph lines, their bridges, their roads, all of those things, their towns have been destroyed by warfare. So rebuilding that is very expensive and is going to cost a lot of money. And you better believe the North does not want to pay for that. That's going to cause some problems moving forward. And lastly, some social consequences. The Civil War is the deadliest war in US history. That's because everyone who was fighting was technically American, even though they might consider themselves Confederacy or Union or whatever. Everyone who lost their lives was an American. So when you look at the death toll compared to the other wars, it's definitely the largest that we've had. We know that a lot of people obviously died in the war, but people who survived are returning home with PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, which is something that wasn't really recognized as an actual like trauma related disorder until the 70s, the 1970s. So in the 1860s, you can imagine that people are not getting help for this and it's not understood. Really, all people knew is that a lot of their loved ones returning home from war were not the same people as when they left. So compounds this, this traumatic experience and the PTSD with also maybe the loss of a limb or something like that, and this is going to completely, change these veterans' lives as they return home. This is a link here if you want to go watch it. It's to a really good little excerpt of an HBO documentary about PTSD. Specifically, this clip is about the Civil War. So if you want to go watch that, go do that. And then lastly, one question that we're going to be facing as we move forward in Reconstruction or this time period after the war is how do we integrate newly freed Black citizens into the country? And that's going to be something that the whole country struggles with, I mean, for decades and decades and decades to come. It's not going to be fixed quickly by any means after the Civil War.